First, it's really great to be here, and it's daunting and fun both to be in a room where you've used so much of the literature that people have written. I mean, Carolyn Merchant's book, Ecological Revolutions, we've used at Antioch, New England in our PhD program for years and years and years as a paragon of interdisciplinary scholarship. And Baird, your work has been really influential and with so many students that I've worked with over the years. And Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, that just phenomenal series, and your graciousness and support of the work that I've done. And it's been just wonderful. And the Indigenous Traditions and Ecology book I've used so many times in a global environmental change class. And there are people here, of course, whose work I'm not as familiar with, and of course, David Abram. But I'm going to talk more about David in a moment as I get more into this. I want to tell a little story about how I got involved in this material, and then what I'm going to do, I think, is an absolutely perfect follow-up to what preceded me. About 11 years ago, it was 1997, it was 9 years ago, I went to Washington to the National Academy of Sciences for the so-called 10th anniversary biodiversity conference. And they were revisiting a historic conference that occurred in 1986, where in fact the word biodiversity was coined as a political term, a metaphorical term to help awake the American public. And in 97, many of the same scientists came back to look at the state of global biodiversity. And there we were in the National Academy of Sciences, this futuristic building where there are no windows, you know, in the middle of downtown Washington. And really so many of the great statured conservation biologists and ecologists were there. And each one was telling a really extraordinary tale of the sixth mega extinction. And you could see from each of their presentations that they were telling stories of both loss and love. That there was a particular species that they were so deeply engaged in that they really came to love the species. And at the same time, they were dealing with its potential demise. And this was very difficult for me to take in. And I drove home on between Washington and New York, and then back up to New England, that incredible industrial megastructure. And I realized that I'm trained in environmental studies. I've been working with this material my entire life, and I just cannot come to grips with what I just learned. Both ecologically, in the sense that, talk about the visible and the invisible, I neither bear witness nor observe these extinctions. And existentially, let's say, what does it mean about the human condition? So it set me essentially on a path which I'm still on, and I want to tell you a little bit more about. Not long after that, my daughter, who was in high school at the time, was taking a philosophy course, and her teacher asked me to come and speak about Thoreau. And I didn't go to my daughter's section. I didn't want to embarrass her. I went to a different class. And I realized I can't spend 45 minutes with these kids talking about Thoreau because Thoreau requires really deep intimacy, and I didn't know them. So instead, I gave them something they were much more familiar with, a quiz. And I gave them there was a famous quiz in the Whole Earth Review, or actually it was in Coevolution Quarterly, 20 questions, the Where You At quiz, which has been reprinted many times, 20 basic questions about the place where you live. And when's the next full moon? When did the deer rot? Name the soil series you're standing on, name 5 migratory birds, 5 wild edible plants, et cetera, et cetera. So I figured I'll give them, this was a great data collection piece for me and a great way to also get a conversation going. And these are rural kids in New Hampshire, and of the 20, all college bound, and of the 20 students in this class, only 3 could answer more than 5 questions correctly, and those that could were the kids who hunt and fish. So I realized, my goodness, we really do have a big challenge on our hands, and that is there's virtually no basic awareness of natural history. So I did my own little experiment, and I was also fueled by David Abram's book, which had come out in 95, I think, spelled essential. No? Yeah, 96, same time as Ecological Identity, actually. And that book was incredibly influential, and I taught from it, in 96 and 97. And I thought that essentially you laid down the challenge, which was, for me, an educational challenge. How do you cultivate biospheric perception? And so your challenge, coupled with this whole experience, led me to actually try to answer that question. How do you cultivate one's awareness of the biosphere through hands-on, everyday life observation of the natural world? So I worked from a basic premise, and that was this, that it is only through intimate awareness of local natural history that one begins to see the bigger picture. The place-based orientation, but also a cognitive orientation. that it's by looking at what's right in front of you and being able to understand it that you could begin to ask deeper questions about where things come from, where they go, how long have they been here, where do they travel from. So I would undertake that experiment myself as someone who was not trained in ecology, but knew something about it. And I began realizing that there were phenological observations that became incredibly clear to me, for example. I didn't really know that the hermit thrush came back the same day every year, although now it comes back earlier, which was an important realization. I didn't really know about monarch butterflies migrating. I didn't know these things, and I really discovered them all through the intimate awareness of local natural history. And then an amazing thing happened. One June, we had a climate change June in New Hampshire, where we just had these microbursts every single day. It was hot and humid and sticky and thick, and by 10 o'clock, the atmosphere had become so saturated that we'd have these incredible storms, and we'd have them overnight. And one day, I was looking at the road, the dirt road in front of my house, and a culvert had broken, and it became a stream. And it's always fun when you have natural disasters that don't hurt anybody, because everyone gets outside, and you have true community natural history awareness. Because everyone's trying to, I used to love snowstorms in New York City when I was a child. I loved the hurricanes when they came through. I have vivid memories of the eyes of hurricanes when I was 5 years old in the New York metropolitan area, because everything stops and you're there. You're there in your body in the natural world. So anyway, everyone's out and they're looking at what happens and wading in the stream, and it's just incredible educational experience. And soon enough, the road, and everyone of course has advice about how to solve the problem. And so good fences make good neighbors, but not when there are disasters in New England. And so sure enough, the road crew finally comes and fixes the entire thing. But I realized that right on my driveway, there was essentially a floodplain, and there was a little sand spit that was a mini geomorphological event. There was, in fact, something that on a much bigger scale would happen over, maybe thousands of years, but it happened in a very small way. And so I began to think, my goodness, yes, in fact, through intimate awareness of local natural history, I can see a bigger picture. And I can begin to understand things like, well, the oak trees that are here have been moving all this time. They move north as the glacier retreats. So everything becomes, I began to look at my own Jewish identity as a diasporan, in fact. And I looked at the fact that I was just passing through this landscape. So this spawned a book, which I wrote, called Bringing the Biosphere Home. And what I realized at the time is that there are two very daunting challenges in front of us to cultivate biospheric perception. One is the raw ecological challenge, that this material, tracing environmental change, is really hard. It's very hard to do. When it's visible, it's difficult, as you well know, from all the graphs and all the variables that go into those graphs and the complicated simulations. And even things that we see may not be real. Things in natural history that we see may not be real. And of course, all the invisible things, as you so nicely suggested with carbon dioxide. But more than an ecological challenge, it's also an existential challenge, because the more you go into this material, the more you realize that it raises fundamental questions about the meaning and purpose of humanity in relationship to the Earth. So that's the path that I've essentially been on. And because we don't have a lot of time, I want to focus specifically on some of the key ecological and existential challenges that I've been working with and where I've gone with some of that material. First of all, if you look at the way education works in North America, if you go into most high schools, the science sequence is not a heck of a lot different than it was when you were in high school. Biology, chemistry, physics. Environmental science is the garbage pail. It's for the lower achieving students. Ninth grade is some kind of Earth system class, but it's, right? And this is a bit of a generalization. There are good schools that are doing it better, but for the most part, it's the same sequence. 30, 40 years later, I was in high school in the mid-60s. It's the same basic sequence. Not only that, but we have no idea from a cognitive perspective how to deal with some of these really interesting questions and challenges. For example, my daughter, who went to Bates College, is a very good student, knew nothing upon graduating from high school about the geological timescale. Now, what's more important, naming the presidents or knowing the sequence of the geological timescale, I ask you? But we don't even know when we would teach the geological timescale. Do you teach it to 5-year-olds? Do you teach it to 10-year-olds? At what stage cognitively do you bring any of these things to youthful, adolescent, or even senior awareness? We have no idea of the sequence of any of these sorts of things. And it's important that we know, because there ought to be some kind of sequential curriculum so we can begin to observe these phenomena in some kind of way that's based on how we know that kids learn. But we don't. We've done virtually no research on this kind of thing. It's really fascinating. So how are we going to solve these problems of environmental change, of global climate change? We have no idea how we're teaching it. We have no idea how we're learning it. So what I want to do, rather than complain about that, is I want to make a series of suggestions to you about how we begin to do this kind of thing. What I try to do personally, what I have tried to do in designing graduate programs, and now that I'm president of an undergraduate college, where I want to move all the faculty in this regard. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the existential challenges, and that's, you know, I'll move all, by then a half an hour should certainly be out. I've been really intrigued by the prefix inter, which is between, the space between. And again, David, this really comes out of your book, as a way of beginning to think about how we learn. By the way, one more thing I want to say about David's work. What David does in The Spell of the Sensuous, although I don't agree with your causation, I think your insights are so incredible and your thought process is so incredible, is that you show us a ray of hope. Because in spite of the fact that it's so daunting to consider environmental change from an ecological point of view, what you show us is that we are still Pleistocene bodies who, through deep sensory awareness, by our birthright, by having these senses, by our birthright, we can immerse ourselves in the natural world in such a way that we can learn an enormous amount. And so that's the great hope of your book. And I think that it's that hope that is bounded on two sides. On the one side by empirical natural history and really sophisticated analytical global change science, because there has to be some foundation based on empiricism. And on the other side, by the life of the imagination, as founded in narrative, in music, in poetry, in dance, in great writing, that brings us all together. It's a threefold approach. It's empiricism, it's imagination, and it's empathy and compassion all together. That comprises our path to learning more about environmental change. If you begin to think about what's happened in the last 30 years in environmental studies, I do this activity with PhD students where I break them into groups and I give them newsprint and I ask them to come up with as many words as they can with eco, green, or environmental in the prefix. And I give them about 10 minutes to do it, and we can come up with 200 words in 10 minutes. And the amazing thing about these words is that none of them appeared in the lexicon before 1970. So the field is moving that quickly, and we are making it as we proceed. So think about that in relationship to what I'm going to go over right now. I think that there are four dimensions of how we begin to think about environmental change: the interspatial, the intertemporal, interspecies, and intergenerational. And I want to look at them all very briefly. Interspatial and intertemporal, by the way, are very hard to distinguish. This is a crude taxonomy at best. In fact, all four of those distinctions are just a way of having fun, because in fact you can't ever really make those distinctions, but you know, that's what we do as intellectuals, as scholars. But let me say a little bit about what some of the interspatial domain is. Biogeochemistry is clearly an interspatial domain. It's the relationship between, if you look at something like the carbon cycle, it's how carbon moves through a space over time. But the idea that a carbon atom can move from the atmosphere to the ocean to the land and back again. Tyler Volk, by the way, does a great job looking at this in Gaia's Body. Is a very interesting and difficult cognitive concept. But if you talk to Montessori teachers, they claim kids can get this as early as 4 and 5 years old because of the imaginative capacity of following a carbon atom through space. I don't know how many of you read Harold and the Purple Crayon. But Harold and the Purple Crayon, which was one of my favorite books as a kid, essentially is Harold travels through space by drawing the space. And then when he gets scared, he's too far from home, he draws the window and his moon and his bed so he can go back to sleep again. But this is a phenomenal journey that a 5-year-old can understand. So something like biogeochemistry can be taught, I think, at that very early age, using the imagination and the life of the carbon cycle. You can do this with anything. You can do it with phosphorus. You can do it with nitrogen. You can do it with water. But this is what I mean by interspatial. And then we might ask, well, how does a 5-year-old learn this? And then a 10-year-old and a 15-year-old. I'll give you another example of my first fluvial geomorphology lesson. I grew up in suburban Long Island, and nothing pleased me more than when someone would wash a car. Because they'd wash a car, and the water it was pretty flat where I grew up, but there was enough topography on the roads that the water would go down, and you'd kind of run after and see where's the water going to go. And you watch it wind around all these places, and it would go on. It would seem for, with tenths of miles, which at that age seemed like miles. And that was a basic lesson in fluvial geomorphology, because you follow the path of water. All of these things are possible. Interspatial also connotes biogeography. It connotes biodiversity. It connotes global atmospheric and oceanic circulations, phytoplanktonic regions, watersheds. Think about the aesthetics and the pattern language that's involved with interspatial phenomena: cycles, branches, fractals, nested hierarchies, variable spatial hierarchies, which is what Allen and Hoekstra deal with, and which you're really talking about here, I think, in many levels. Powers of 10, networks, nodes in networks, boundaries, edges, patches, mosaics, corridors. These are aesthetic patterns of great beauty that are, and I think we find them very beautiful because they, in fact, are a representation of natural systems that you can teach at virtually any age. But this is what I mean by interspatial. And these are the sorts of things that anyone can observe, and I think it's this hands-on learning in relationship to environmental change that's so crucial. Continental drift and tectonics. Again, it's the boundary of space and time. But imagine what imagination it took for Darwin to see that and understand that there was strata in Africa and strata in South America that linked up enough to totally change the way we conceived of time. I mean, that's just a remarkable conceptualization. It didn't have to have been Darwin. It could have been many people at the same time who came up with that. Continental plates, and all of these concepts, by the way, are so recent in human history, at least in terms of Western science. So that's interspatial. Intertemporal to me, represents the biggest intertemporal concept is the history of life on Earth, 5 billion years. I mean, what's the annual budget in terms of how much money we spend in Iraq? Right? It's like a figure even greater than that. You can't even there's no way you can even wrap your mind. I don't understand 5 billion, I'll be the first to tell you. But it's a major concept, right? I mean, 5 billion years is probably the history of life on Earth, and then we have the geological time scale within that. How can you understand climate change if you don't understand the geological time scale? I mean, if you think that the Earth is 5,000 years old, how are you possibly going to have a true cognitive understanding of climate change? It's a very difficult challenge, I think. So also, the intertemporal gets us into issues of origins, lineage, ancestry. And there are many intertemporal observations one can make. My favorite mini-temporal observation is phenology, where you can actually trace the coming and going of spring and fall. That is, by the way, one of the best data sets that we have that proves climate change. The fact that we have really good data that suggests that spring arrives earlier and fall leaves later everywhere on Earth. You can watch that happening. You can trace it. You can keep records. You can keep natural history records. And within several lifetimes, you have phenological evidence. So to me, that's sort of a mini intertemporal observation. Here's how you get access to it, but it will only happen if people are watching what's right in front of them. It's very basic, I think. Once you get into intertemporal, then you get other really beautiful patterns like waves and thresholds and cycles again and rates and speed. This is the place where space meets time in the service of intertemporal observation. Then there's interspecies observation, the relationship between story, subsistence, and natural history. This is where indigenous knowledge comes into play, because without overly romanticizing what other cultures knew or didn't know, the fact is that because most cultures did live closer to the land, regardless of what their ultimate experience was in terms of exploitation and relative success, the fact is there was always a relationship between story, subsistence, and natural history. The interpenetration of animal and human lives. This is another great field day for the imagination. It's something that lives in our dreams. It's something that we all have access to every minute of every day. It doesn't matter who you are or where you're growing up. You have access to the interpenetration of animal and human lives. And I think that axis of interpenetration is crucial for observing environmental change. One of the most wonderful relationships that deals with interspecies understanding of environmental change is mycorrhizal fungi. You know, or lichen. All of these things, and again, it starts with basic awareness of local natural history. You kind of look at lichen growing on a rock and ask, what is this? How did it get here? How long has it been here? How old are these lichen? Not only in terms of the particular life cycle of this one organism, but how long have they been on Earth? At some point, reread The Voyage of the Beagle and look at Darwin's chapter on the Galapagos and look at his questions. He asks a series of 50, 60 questions over and over again to understand the life cycle of every organism that go through every one of these interspecies, intertemporal, and interspatial relationships. Invasive species, by the way, is another very interesting one. That's the great conceit is for us to describe something as an invasive species. But in fact, these things are just moving around for all kinds of reasons. And it's a very interesting way for understanding environmental change. Finally, the fourth is intergenerational, and that's the one that we've lost. I think that environmental education needs to go back to an intergenerational orientation. It is, over time, lots of people sharing their records. It's young people and old people together looking at the natural world in service of community. If you speak to people who've lived on a landscape a long time and ask them to tell the stories of what that place was like, they have remarkable natural history knowledge. This needs to be resurrected. So these are all hands-on dimensions of observing environmental change in the here and now. And then we start getting into these deeper philosophical and psychological, archetypal, metaphorical concepts. For example, biogeochemical cycles, to me, are one of the best living manifestations of Thich Nhat Hanh's notion of interbeing. I mean, it's just perfect. It's the transformation of matter and energy through these remarkable circulations. Weathering, erosion, geological processes are wonderful manifestations of impermanence. The dissolution of time and space. But they're right there in front of you. They're hands-on. The Indra's net, the notion of the intricate awareness of all things we see in watersheds. We see in the fluxes, we see in flows, we see in the pattern language of variable spatial hierarchies or landscape ecology. And all of this stuff is coming together, and it's really exciting. These are states of mind and art, these notions of interbeing, impermanence, and connectivity. So that's the first main point I want to make, is that it's important that we get access to all of this through our hands-on observation all the time, and not, with all due respect to the wonderful presentations that came before me, not over-psychologize it either. It's hands-on. We are the last generation that has access to this, in a sense. Now, what happens is when you get hands-on, the great overlooked secret of interdisciplinary environmental studies is that you can go just anywhere you want, almost any college or university in North America, and you will be hard-pressed to find a course that deals with the existential dimensions. There are courses that do it, but that deal with issues of the relationship between wonder and indifference, for example, or between hope and foreboding, or creation and extinction. These are really tough challenges. And most of the time, these are challenges that I assume that are covered in churches. I don't know. I don't go. But think about it. If you study this material, and if you have any reflective awareness at all, immediately you're going to come to grips with some of these questions. And I see them all the time in the front lines of environmental education. Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great Jewish philosopher and one of my most important teachers, writes that indifference to the sublime wonder of living is the root cause of sin. And what he means by that is the minute you stop looking and the minute you stop appreciating this remarkable gift of perception that you've been given, this Pleistocene birthright, you go down the road to indifference. So it's the balance, and we're all indifferent sometimes. We have no choice but to be. If you're in a state of wonder all the time, you're kind of insipid. You're not believable. But if you're in a state of indifference all the time, you know what it leads to. But we don't really talk about this very much in relationship to how we observe environmental change. The relationship between creation and extinction is the relationship between life and death. That's this notion of love and loss. This has to be dealt with as well. These difficult existential challenges. The relationship between hope and foreboding. We've all grown up, and I mean, gosh, many of us grew up at a time when you know, we were in 3rd grade and we were told to put our heads down on the desk because of an air raid. What is that? What's the long-term damage of that? I asked the psychologist. So there's nothing new about this apocalyptic fear. We've grown up with it all the time. Yet at the same time, I remember growing up in elementary school and being told about this fantastic future, that we were on the space race and what that was going to do for us. So we've all lived with this sense of hope and fear. It's just part of our lives. And of course, now the latest manifestation of it is this terrorist stuff. It's always there, lurking behind some dark door. There's something you need to be paranoid about. Climate change represents the same thing, something you can't see. You know, the ozone hole is the bald spot on the top of your head. You don't know it's there unless someone else points it out. And these things are all really metaphorically rich. We don't really have the equipment to deal with what they mean in terms of our own future, in terms of our psyches. But I think they're interconnected. I think there is no deep awareness of local natural history and environmental change without eventually coming to grips with some of these more existential challenges. So that's pretty much what I want to say. Now, one last thing, and that's this. I think it's great to talk about intimate awareness of local natural history, but the fact of the matter is, folks, it's not happening. And I don't know that we're going to be able to do anything that's really going to change that very much. And I don't want to end on a bummer. So what I want to suggest now is that that's where the sustainability movement comes in. Because you may not go out and look at the natural world, or we may have a whole generation of people who are no longer doing that, but everyone lives in a building. And everyone has ideas about the place where they ought to live. And I think it's so crucial that we get kids and adults alike rethinking the places where they live, wherever we work, in every single institution. David Orr is dead on, I wish he were here right now, dead on about this. But we need to make every building we live in a living museum of natural history. Where do things come from and where do they go? Where is the matter and energy exchange here? What is the life that lives in this building that shares it with us? How do we design this building so we can lead good lives here? I think really that is the new frontier of environmental education and ultimately of how we observe environmental change. Because we can think about all the issues that have been brought up this morning within the context of the actual buildings in which we live. So I don't want to give up on this important, emphasis on place-based natural history as a way of perceiving global change. But I think it's really important. The fact of the matter is the building environment is one of the really important places for us to do this work as well. So that's it. I tried to cram in as much as I could and looking at what came before me and what was going to come after me and where I might fit. And I have nothing more to say right now. Thank you.